When we look at the production side of the economy, we see employers making many decisions regarding how they're going to produce commodities or services. Sometimes labor-intensive methods of production are used, and sometimes capital methods of production are used. Well, how do employers decide how much labor and capital to use to produce output? This is an important question because once we understand how employers or producers make decisions regarding inputs, we can begin to consider what factors cause employers to change the way they produce a good or service, and that has important implications for employment opportunities. Most of us only have our labor to sell in the market. Therefore, the decisions by employers regarding how much labor they employ and how much that labor will be paid is central to our economic opportunities. So let's consider how employers decide how much labor to employ and what the wage of that labor will be.
This is a working man's country, and I'm doing my part to keep it that way.
To make things easy, we'll begin with the assumption that labor is the only input that firms can choose to vary. The capital that labor uses to produce output will be fixed. In other words, there's a given number of machines, and we want to know how much labor the firm will hire. Later, we'll relax this assumption, and things will get a bit more complicated. So why would employers want to hire labor in the first place? It's because labor assists in the production of output. It's only because labor produces an output that can be sold on the market that makes labor valuable to an employer. In this sense, we say that labor is a derived demand. The more output people want that labor produces, the greater the demand for labor. In other words, the benefit of hiring a worker is based on the output the worker produces, and that's valued at the market price. Two workers are building a computer. The computers will sell in the market for $1,000 each. The first worker, call him Ted, builds 5 computers in one day. The second worker, call her Alice, builds 6 computers in one day. Well, what is the value of each worker to the firm? Ted generates 5 times $1,000 or $5,000 of revenue. Alice generates 6 times $1,000 or $6,000 of revenue. What we've done is compute the value of each worker's marginal product, which is simply the marginal product of each worker valued at its market price.
And American industry, fighting mad, rolls up its sleeves.
The value of the marginal product gives us a measure of the benefits an employer receives from workers. To make a decision, however, regarding how much labor to hire, the employer needs to also consider the costs. Recall that optimal decisions in economics are based on comparing marginal benefits with marginal costs. So what's the marginal cost to an employer from hiring one additional worker? The wage. For example, if the wage is $10 per hour, each additional hour of employment would cost the firm $10 additional. But this is just marginal cost of labor. What is the change in the cost of labor when I add one more unit of labor? Now we can look at how much labor a profit-maximizing firm would employ. Suppose we have an employer who wants to hire labor to pick cherries, and assume that all cherry pickers are exactly the same, and the size of the orchard is fixed. In other words, labor is the only variable input. The market price of each basket of cherries is assumed to be $5. The employer begins by hiring one cherry picker, then the next, and so on. Let's examine the benefits each worker brings to the employer. In this table, we see that Bob 1 picks 6 baskets of cherries in 1 hour, generating benefits of $30 to the firm. Bob 2 picks fewer baskets than Bob 1 and generates only $25 in benefits to the firm. Next comes Bob 3, who generates $15, and Bob 4 is the worst. He only picks 2 baskets an hour. Now, why is this? It's weird because we assume that all workers were exactly the same. The reason why Bob 4 does so poorly is this. As the 4th cherry picker is hired, he picks less cherries because the first set of Bobs picked cherries on the lowest, most accessible branches. Bob 4 was stuck climbing trees to get cherries from the very top branches. This illustrates the idea of diminishing marginal productivity of labor. In other words, given a fixed input, for instance in our case the size of the orchard, as more labor is hired, each successive laborer picks less cherries. The end result is the value of the marginal product declines as each additional unit of labor is hired. Our cherry farmer now has to figure out how many bobs to employ by comparing the marginal benefits, the value of the marginal product, to the marginal cost, the wage. If the market wage is more than $30 per hour, say $32, the cherry farmer would just let the birds take his cherries because the first picker, Bob 1, only brings in revenue of $30. Why pay out $32 and take in $30 and end up $2 in the hole? Well, what if the wage was $15 an hour? The farmer would hire Bob 1 because he brings in $30 and only costs $15. The farmer would hire Bob 2 because he brings in $25 and only costs $15 also. In effect, the farmer makes a marginal profit off of each worker if the value of the marginal product is greater than the market wage. The farmer should keep hiring labor as long as each laborer contributes some positive amounts to profits. Now, this occurs as long as the value of marginal product is greater than the wage. Therefore, the hiring decision of the firm is to employ labor up to the point where the value of marginal product is equal to the wage. You should recognize this as simply a marginal benefit equals marginal cost condition for optimal decision making. Its implications are that the wage paid to labor is equal to the value society places upon the output of that laborer.
Historical Moments with John Watkins, Ph.D.
The marginal productivity theory of distribution was developed by J.B. Clark as an alternative to Marx's theory of exploitation. In Clark's words, the distribution of income of society is controlled by a natural law, and this law, if it worked without friction, would give to every agent of production the amount of wealth which that agent creates. Clark's theory asserts that each individual receives the value of his or her contribution to society. In brief, the marginal productivity theory is a theory regarding the economic valuation of human beings. Your income reflects your value to society. If you have no income, from an economic point of view, you have no value. What does this mean? It means that a drug lord who earns $3 million a year is 100 times more valuable than a school teacher earning $30,000 a year. Moreover, the theory says that each person gets what he or she deserves. Hence, there is no exploitation. No one is taking advantage of another. The $20 million accruing to Michael Jordan for promoting Nike shoes reflects his contribution. The 50 cents an hour to the 10-year-old Indonesian kid who made those shoes reflects his contribution. Marx, of course, asserted that all value results from the expenditure of human labor. Labor acts as the catalyst that transforms capital and raw materials into useful products. While capital and raw materials are necessary for production, they do not create value. Marx's view reflects that of Smith, who said, "Labor is the original purchase price paid for all things. The value of any commodity reflects the quantity of labor embodied. The reason diamonds command a higher price than water is because more labor is expended to acquire diamonds and water. The same is true for labor. The value of the labor, what Marx called labor power, reflects the quantity of labor embodied in those commodities necessary for the worker to perform his job. In other words, a worker's income reflects the value of those commodities necessary to survive. How does Marx explain profits? Profits arise because the value the workers create exceed their wages. Why do capitalists get the profit? Profits arise not because capital is productive, but because capitalists own the means of production. Profit is the condition upon which capitalists grant workers access to the means of production. Without access to the means of production, workers could not survive. Capitalism works by coercively forcing workers to work more than they would otherwise. What appears as a purely economic relation for Marx represents a relationship among human beings, a relation based on force and exploitation.
Yes, and we're also building a lot of equipment for national defense.
And tools for food production, too.
The demand for labor curve is simply a schedule of the amount of labor a firm would employ for every possible wage rate. In this graph, we plot the value of marginal product curve and vary the wage. If the wage is W1, the firm hires L1 units of labor. If the wage is W2, the firm hires L2 units of labor. So how much labor is employed? Well, this depends upon the wage. Okay, so what determines the wage? Because without this, we can't say if the firm will hire L1 or L2 amounts of labor. The wage is the price of labor. Since we have a demand for labor, all we need now is the supply of labor, and then we'll have a labor market. And equilibrium in this market will determine the wage. Okay, well, let's bring in the supply of labor. It's something we previewed when talking about consumer choice, but now we'll discuss it in more detail. Labor supply is based on asking how much people would work at a given wage rate. To answer this question, we have to ask, why do people work? Economists like to think that work is a bad thing, meaning it only gives disutility. Would you go to work if you didn't get paid for it? The only reason people work is to earn income in order to consume. If wages go up, some people would like to work more because they can earn more income to consume, and this would make them feel better off. In other words, they are buying a higher indifference curve. Now, there may be some people, however, who are, when faced with an increase in wages, may actually choose to work less. Don't they want to consume? Yes, but they want to consume more leisure time instead of commodities. Going to work means you earn more to increase your consumption of commodities, but at the expense of your leisure time. In deciding how much to work at a given wage, individuals have to evaluate the utility they get from consumption versus leisure. As wages increase, this choice is reevaluated. Higher wages mean the opportunity cost of an hour of leisure time becomes more expensive because you're giving up the higher wage. Some individuals may choose to work more, higher wages, more labor supply. For others who are satisfied with their existing level of consumption, the higher wage means they could work less and still consume the same amount of goods, but have more leisure time. So higher wages, less labor supply. So what happens to the supply of labor when wages go up? Does it go up or down? Economists say both can happen, and they do. To make our life simple, though, we will assume that the effects of a higher wage result in an increase in the supply of labor. This is shown on this graph. Now that we have a supply and demand for labor, we have a market. It's both the supply of labor and the demand for labor that determines both the wage and the amount of labor hired by employers. Pay attention to the fact that we have assumed that labor is the only variable input in the production process. Namely, we're talking about the demand for labor in the short run.
I think certainly to some degree, what we expect to happen in the labor market does happen. And sometimes it may not be what people think ought to happen. And maybe sports is a good example of that. I mean, yeah, in the last year, you saw these basketball players signing these huge contracts, folks who were just 1 or 2 years out of college. And I think a lot of people commented that, it doesn't make sense, it's not right that this person should make this much money, and so forth. But probably what's going on there is to some degree, the market is paying these folks what they generate in revenue for the teams. Whether or not you think that what Michael Jordan does is worth whatever he gets next year, $25 million or something, whether or not you think it's inherently worth that. If he's putting so many folks in the seats, then in some sense, if he's able to cause team owners to bid against each other for his services, then he's going to begin to get something reflecting the value of his labor, the value of his skills. So, I think certainly in lots of ways we get what we expect. I mean, we can make predictions and they come out right. I think there's something about the way that investment in education affects your earnings that makes sense even under the simplest models of labor markets. But it's kind of really trying to work out precisely what's going on. There's still a lot of variation there to be explained.
So what can lead to a change in the wage rate and employment? The most important factors are a change in the supply of labor, a change in the output price, and a change in the marginal product of labor. If there's an increase in the supply of cherry pickers, for example, each bob is cloned, the wage would fall and employment would go up. Suppose that people increased their demand for cherries and that resulted in an increase in the market price. If that's the case, then the demand for cherry pickers would increase, resulting in an increase in both wages and employment. The fact that the output price is included in the demand for labor links employment in different sectors of the economy with the output market for goods and services. Thus, we could say that your wage, in part, depends on how much society values what you're producing. But what about technological change? Well, let's go back to our set of Bobs about this. They can tell you a story. One day, Bob 4 was standing under a cherry tree. He'd been thinking about the breakup with his girlfriend the night before and began banging his head on the tree, saying, "How stupid I am." Cherries began to fall on his head. One cherry, in particular, fell on his head and gave him an idea. A machine that would bang cherry trees, making all the cherries fall on the ground so they could be picked up quickly. This would save the time of lugging a ladder around from tree to tree and trying to reach the cherries on top. Bob 4 told the owner of the orchard of his idea. The owner, determining that the new machine would increase the profits of the orchard, built the new machine. This new machine was such that only Bob 1 was needed. Bob 2 was needed to pick up the cherries, and Bob 3 and Bob 4 were put to rest. The new technology created unemployment. But let's think about this a bit more. Does new technology create unemployment? Well, first, what do we mean by new technology? Technological change is part of a dynamic economy. When technological change occurs, employment may be displaced in some sectors. However, new employment is created in the firms producing machines. In addition, if technological change reduces the cost of production, then product prices fall. These lower prices mean higher demand. The lower costs of production mean higher profits. These higher profits can be spent on other goods or services. So technological change can also result in new goods and services that we consume, which were previously not available.
Military and production engineers pool their skills, redesign plants, and speed up production.
In fact, technological change leading to an increase in productivity is one of the primary ways a country increases its standard of living. This is a fundamental economic principle. The standard of living for an economy can't increase unless the same inputs can produce more output. Well, basically, if we all lived on farms, our standard of living would only increase if we could somehow increase the output of our farms, which gives us more food. The surplus food could be used to support people not working on farms and producing other items such as farm tools, clothes, transportation, furniture, medical care, and education. In this way, an economy grows and develops as each individual specializes in the production of goods and services.
Not all of us can make munitions. Not all of us can build the guns. Not all of us can build the ships. Not all of us can build the fighting planes. Nor can all of us grow the food.
What does concern economists about technological change is not that it creates unemployment, which it doesn't in the aggregate, but rather there may be effects on the distribution of income. Let's consider this in the context of our world today. One of the striking features of the U.S. economy in the 1980s and 1990s has been the decline in the real wage of workers with high school education or less. This decline has been generally estimated to be about 15% over the period of 1973 to 1993. Since high school educated workers or less make up over 60% of the workforce in 1993, this is a significant trend. Let's try and use our simple model of labor markets to gain some insight regarding this trend in wages for workers with this degree of education. Consider two labor markets, one for the production of goods and services such as durable goods, cars, steel, and machine tools, the other for services such as wholesale and retail trade and medical care. Wages in each sector are based on the value of the marginal product. The The marginal product of labor depends largely on the capital that labor has to work with, so workers in the capital-intensive goods-producing sectors would receive a higher wage than workers in the labor-intensive service sectors. In fact, this is what we observe. For example, workers in the goods-producing sector of the economy received an hourly compensation of $20.22 in 1993, or about $40,000 a year. Those in the service sector received about $15.51, or approximately $30,000 a year. Now suppose all of the workers were employed in the goods sector. If so, the average hourly wage for all labor would be about $20.22. Conversely, if all workers were employed in the service sector, the average hourly wage would be about $15.51. For the economy as a whole, the average hourly wage would depend on the share of workers employed in each sector. Well, what's happened to these shares over time? Let's consider some data for the United States. In this table, we see the share of the workforce in the goods and service sectors for 1979 and 1993. Notice that the share of the workforce in the United States employed in the goods-producing sector has declined from about 30% to about 20%, while that of the service sector has increased from about 70 to 80%. This change in the composition would lower the average hourly wage for workers in the United States. For wages for workers with high school education or less would actually fall by more than those for workers with a college education, because the service jobs that low-skilled workers find are likely to be in the service occupations that have low wages.
You might have a set of variables that affect earnings, say, that you might think of as explicitly economic factors, and things like education, some of the things we've talked about. Other things that might seem to be less economic, that might be thought of as sociological. For instance, when I was in graduate school, it seemed to me that a lot of the folks that I was in school with had at least one parent who was also an academic, right? So there's a sense in which part of your occupation choice might be related to folks what folks that you admire did themselves, what your parents did, for instance. Or it might be related to the information that you get about different job opportunities, which is determined, kind of outside your own choice by your parents or by their associates or by where you live. And then there are factors that are strictly related to luck, how the market changes for specific kinds of work. I mean, if you figured that you wanted to be an auto worker in the 1950s maybe, that might have been a reasonable choice to make if you didn't want to stay in school long, you wanted to get out and get working, you might have been able to make good money at that. Or say a steel worker. But over time, the market for those things changes for reasons beyond your control, and your wages fall. So I think a lot of the time we try to interpret, say, earnings as evidence on how hard people work or how much ability they have. But in fact, we recognize that a whole lot of other factors come into play there, that beyond the individual's choice. If economics is sort of about the choices that folks are making in order to achieve certain ends, sometimes lots of other things come into play that sort of break the relationship between the choice and the ends that come about.
Well, what accounts for this shift of employment? Where have all the good jobs gone for high school educated workers? This is an area of intense research, and the general consensus is that many of these jobs have been lost to technological change. Remember the story about Bob and the cherry tree. The Bobs that became unemployed in the cherry orchard became the servant of the owners, who now had income because the orchard was so much more productive. While this is a simplistic account of these trends, clearly the situation is complex, with real effects on the employment opportunities in the economy. For those whose opportunities have deteriorated, what's to be done? This is one of those interesting questions that focus both upon the individual who should acquire more schooling so that they don't end up with low-wage jobs. But what about those who can't acquire more schooling? No easy answer can be found, because technological progress is inherent in a capitalistic economy where competition forces firms to find the lowest cost methods of production in order to remain competitive. Capitalism is not a system that is known for its kindness, and it's here that governments and society have a role in easing the transitional pains associated with economic change.